LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Kingsley Dennis, who joins us to discuss his book, Healing the Wounded Mind, the Psychosis of the Modern World and the Search for the Self. Any thinking person watching television or reading a newspaper today is bound to wonder if humanity has lost its mind, and in a way we have. What can only be described as mass psychosis is sweeping the world with gathering force, unhinging individuals, institutions and nations alike. A vicious circle driven by propaganda, fear-mongering and media manipulation makes us increasingly vulnerable to more of the same, while the stupefying circus of mindless entertainment and staged spectacles leaves us in no condition to truly think for ourselves. Is it possible that any of this madness can be traced to repressed trauma or scars in the collective unconscious? If the human psyche is somehow incubating a mental or spiritual virus, it might account for our self-sabotaging and at times suicidal insanity. Maybe the myths about ancient archetypes and entities, such as the Archons or Ahriman, actually hold seeds of truth. Whatever the case, accelerating technology and expanding interconnectedness are lending the term viral a darker hue, threatening to turn even more of us into clones, drones, and automatons. Hello and welcome, Kingsley, and thank you so much for joining us once again on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Thank you, Greg. As always, it's a pleasure.
Today, Kingsley, we're going to be talking about your recent book, Healing the Wounded Mind, the Psychosis of the Modern World, and the Search for the Self. To get started, just tell listeners a little bit about yourself and about the book.
Well, myself, my background, I've worked a number of years in teaching education and sociology in various places around the world, universities in Turkey and England. And I've looked at changing social systems and how human consciousness and human thinking patterns affect social processes. That's more or less where I started, because I left university about 10 years ago now and went freelance writing. And as you know yourself, I've had a few books under my belt. And generally, I've always looked at the positive, constructive effects of human thinking patterns and generally how that affects the transitions we're going through, especially in the last, in the point where we are now in this kind of crossroads, as many people have referred to it. And I've looked at how complex systems come together with consciousness and how they create tipping points. And I've looked at the shifting in many institutions, whether social, cultural, economic, political, and say generally from a positive evolutionary perspective. And recently, noticing how the shifts, a lot of the shifts in the world at the moment, they haven't played out yet. And a lot of the kind of disturbances and the conflagration of events have not played through into an outcome yet. And I wanted to look at how we are in this particular moment. It seems like we're stuck in the middle of this kind of transition. It's like we've left one point, like imagine you're sitting in a bar and you get off one bar stool and you want to get onto another bar stool, but you haven't got there yet. You're in the middle. And I think we're in the middle at the moment, and we are struggling with this shift and transition, and it's affecting more our perceptions, and how we think and our emotions and a lot of areas of human life. So I wanted to look at that, and that what brought me to this present book, because it feels like that we need a kind of catharsis to heal ourselves, and not only individually but on a global scale, because it seems that many almost a projection playing out, externalizing a lot of issues right now, a lot of issues which we have to go through individually, and also it seems that we need to externalize them. So it's a look at the present time more than the future transitions or the future movements. I've always kind of focused on the future pathways previously. This time I wish to focus more on the present and to look at, say, before we get to the complete positive outcome, or before we get to the end of the transition, what's affecting our mental state? Because something must be wrong. Look at the world around us. It seems as if we are in a state of kind of upside down topsy-turviness, and we are thinking crazily a lot of times. So that's the point. That's the springboard, Greg, where I started with the book, because something isn't quite right, and that's why I started to research.
Okay, well, you used the word crossroads there, and as you said, many other people have used similar words in this context. Do you really feel that that's the case where we are? I mean, clearly you do on one level, but what's behind my question is that this is something that other people have pointed out has been going on for a long time. We had a sort of a existential crisis as the year 2000 approached. We're led to believe in history a similar thing happened at the year 1000. So the idea that we're at a sort of a tipping point or a crossroads sort of for the entire future of the species is actually quite an old one. And again, I'm not trying to debunk the idea at all. I'm just trying to get at your feeling about that and your thoughts on the fact that this is a recurring motif.
Yes, Greg, it is a recurring motif, and you're quite right. And I don't generally use the word crossroads. It popped up in my language just now, because actually I look at it in terms of systems and more in terms of cycles. My background is in systems theory and complex systems, and I see things as cycles which are coming around again, or you could say a spiral whereby things have come around again, but we're not in the same place. We don't come around to exactly the same place. We've moved to a different space, i.e. a spiral could be further up. But I'm not talking about time so much. I don't talk about linear time. I'm not talking about space and a particular place along the cycle or the spiral. These are all just kind of analogies that human thinking uses. What I do feel that we're going through in a long process is one of a kind of evolutionary mutation or adaptation. We are evolving, but from a side of consciousness, not from a material side. But that evolution of consciousness or shift in consciousness affects material structures. And this is a very long, ongoing process. And so we get various manifestations in the external physical world of what's going on, let's say, from a non-material consciousness level. Now, I say that because I maybe should make my standpoint clear here, is that I've outlined in my work that my position is that consciousness is primary and material manifestations, or the universe of matter, reality as we understand it, is a secondary phenomenon. And also is that consciousness is not produced by the human brain in humans. And therefore consciousness is a field effect. Let's say we could refer to it as the 0 point field, which is the field of energy from which all matter manifests. And the human brain, which is only one part of the brain in the human body, I feel that the whole body, nervous system, the heart, is a whole kind of brain of the body. But the human neocortex, and what we know as the brain, is a kind of interpreter. And that picks up fields of consciousness, interprets that, and helps to kind of place a perception, a reality perception for human beings. So consciousness is primary. As we interpret that, and as that shifts, then we are going to see ripples out and different manifestations physically. So it's not really a crossroads per se, although I did use that term, so I do take complete credit for it. What I feel is that as this mutation or shift in consciousness is at a further along point, we're going to see further disturbances. And how we perceive reality and how we deal with reality is what is, I think, one of the prime causes at the moment of both our potential futures and the disturbances that we're seeing right now.
Well, back in the material world, it was a few months ago that your book came to my attention because I follow your work, obviously, so I know when you've got something new coming out. I subscribe to your mailing list, as other people should consider doing. But I had a couple of books that I'd also come to my attention, and I remember posting something about this on social media, and I know that you noticed this. And these two books were one by a guy called Frank, either Furedi or Furedi, I don't know how to pronounce his name, and his book's entitled How Fear Works. And the second book was by Douglas Murphy, I think that's his name. And anyway, the book's called The Madness of Crowds, and it's receiving a lot of attention at the minute. He's an English author. And these deal with different dimensions of how we're collectively becoming unhinged, basically mass psychosis, to pull a word from the title of your book. And it seems like, that we're collectively, if we think of ourselves as individuals like cells in the body of humanity, we are like a body fighting with itself. This is something that has been ramping up now for quite a few years, and I think this is something that, in your own way, your own take on it, that part of your book is tapping into, is observing this derangement, this collective derangement that we're undergoing.
Yeah, sure. And I did see your post, and that's right. I did notice those books. And I think you're right. It's hard not to see it. It's, you have to have some part of your head in the sand not to notice this derangement going on. And so it's naturally going to draw our attention. And so, for generally that, in terms of the human condition, we look at the physical body or the emotions, and we say we have to look after our body. We go on diets, we do exercise, we watch how we eat. And yet very few of us, or it's not part of our general narrative, is to actually take care of our minds. And I think this actually is the primary thing, is the mind, because the state of mind will have a huge effect on the body. But more than that, it'll have effect on how we interpret the world around us and how we experience the world around us. The state of mind is paramount. And so if we see this kind of craziness in the world now, one of the reasons why I think it's such heightened, this kind of, let's say, mass psychosis, is because we are at a state of interconnectedness like never before. And we don't have to speak too much about that. That again is self-explanatory with our global communications, our internet, social media. People are showing themselves so much more and revealing themselves and participating, or at least observing, in a global dialogue. So that's really putting everything out there, as we used to say, washing your dirty linen in public. Now, on the other side, as I mentioned, the consciousness factor is that, as I understand it, we receive consciousness. And if you think that you produce it, my thinking patterns, my state of mind, I produce it, I'm responsible for that, then you don't think too much about it. You think, if I choose to think bad, I will. If I choose to think good thoughts, I will. And so you think like, you've got that nailed. And so it's not really a part of one's general concern. But if I turn that around and I say to you, well, what if actually our interpretations come from our social conditioning? So we have some let's say, responsibility for the interpretation. But actually, the much grander state of mind, the vibrational state, the energetic state, state of nervousness, anxiety, and these issues, a lot of that is that we pick up, just as your radio would pick up static from the airways if you're not properly tuned in, or if you're tuned into a heavy metal station, or you'll get different type of music. So the brain will pick up different kind of states of consciousness. If we're not aware of them, then what we do is that we imbue them, and then we actually re-put them out again. And we're contributing to the field of consciousness globally. And therefore, a lot of the time, we're contributing to the dissonance. Now, if you consider it that way, then it gives you an angle to see how this mass psychosis or the madness of the crowds may be happening, because from a material level, we're participating in our technical device of communication, sharing everything and our thoughts like never before, but also we're sharing a state of energetic state, a mental state that we're releasing. And we may not be completely aware of those energetic states that we're putting out could belong to some kind of corruption or an anxiety that we are perpetrating, where we're actually spreading like a meme. And we are part of that spreading that energetic state. My perception is that is more the case of what is happening now.
Yeah, well, anybody who's ever been to a large event with large crowds, like a music concert or a sports event, will understand the power of that mass mind, the mood and how it can change. Anybody who's been to a protest or a political event that's turned into a riot will understand that change can occur and how you can get subsumed into it as an individual, even as an individual mind. So that's very powerful in itself. And again, if your awareness isn't very keen, it's very easy to get caught up in that sort of thing. Now, there are positive dimensions of that. Of course there are, but we're talking about the negative aspects of it. You talked about the interconnectedness, the heightened interconnectedness that we have as a species at the moment. And again, this is something that's ultimately very positive, I think, but there are downsides, there are risks. And in a way, by connecting to the internet literally with our devices, so we connect our minds with one another, and you can get a virus on your computer or your device. Equally, you can get a mind virus, same method.
Yeah, that's so true. And actually, as you say, there's benefits and downsides to everything. That is the way of life. The crux is to be aware of it, and awareness then will help one to make a choice and to choose how to participate. Now, for example, you talk about energy, and you rightly said that if you can be caught up in the madness of a crowd. Now, this was used to horrendous effects during the Nazi propaganda, when the huge rallies would just sweep the people up, and so a lot of that kind of madness occurred in physical spaces and physical crowds, because that was the only way that huge numbers could gather. Now we're on our mental sphere. We're on the noosphere, as they call it, with the internet, and we can gather millions of people and in a similar way. And so it's very important to be mindful of that. So, for example, if you walk into a sacred building, such as a church or any sacred place, and you're in a state of devotion, a state of heart and mind concentration, then you can feel the energy build up. And people have spoken about this in all ways of life. You feel the energy in that place. Now, that's because we do emit these energies. We emit them electromagnetically. We emit them in consciousness fields. Now, you put that in the negative situation, as you say, where you're in a place of violence, or you're in a place of just, let's say, non-harmonious thoughts or anxiety, frustration, fear. And fear is one of the most powerful negative vibrational energies available. And if you put that into a space where that can be utilized, then it's very dangerous. And I think we're not really aware generally of how much we are the emitters of these non-physical or non-visible energies, which are primary. And I think now that we are using the technology to such a degree in our lives all the time, I think we should be more mindful that we participate physically, emotionally, mentally, and with consciousness in everything we do. And therefore, everything has an effect.
Now, something that you get into in your new book, which greatly interests me, and it's an area that I'd read about before, was various concepts, whatever names you choose to give them, that of Wetiko, the Archons, entities such as Ahriman, concept of the demiurge, what you refer to as mental pathogen, which echoes something I was saying a moment ago. And I first came across this many years ago in the work of Paul Levy, American author. You might be aware of his work in this area. But it was very interesting that you got into that, especially at this time, because these are areas that a lot of people will readily dismiss as, folk tales, myths,
Yes, and I probably would not have come across these themes before in the same way. It crossed my radar. Now, when I first came across this idea in the work of Carlos Castaneda, and his book, The Active Side of Infinity, talks about these mind predators or mind parasites, which Don Juan calls predators. And he actually says in that book, The Active Side of Infinity, which I recommend reading, that these predators, they did a wonderful strategy. What the strategy was is that instead of trying to attack people mentally, what they did is that they gave people their own minds. They insinuated themselves into people's minds, so you wouldn't even notice their presence. And it's like a kind of energetic virus. Now, I read that book many, many years ago, and this concept intrigued me, but I hadn't really found it correlated in many other places. So it just kind of dropped away from my radar. And like most things that I research and write, they come across, they kind of tap me on the shoulder or they nudge me and say, look at this. And so I go away and look at it. And very timely I looked at the work of Jack Forbes, who had the work, The Wetiko, which Paul Levy in his book, Dispelling Wetiko, also referred to. And I am aware of Paul Levy's work as well, which I think is merits reading. And so Wetiko from Jack Forbes, he was a native American Indian scholar, and he saw this disease as a civilizational disease, especially from the colonizing or the European forces. But he seemed to think that the reason why Western civilization or European civilization in the last few centuries had been so successful is because they adopted a certain mindset, or rather they adopted a corrupted mindset and agreed with this virus way of thinking of competition, conquest, and all this kind of very disagreeable forms of slavery and power show. And he called that a civilizational disease. So I thought that was interesting. And I started to look around, and then I went back to Steiner's work, Rudolf Steiner, and his work on Ahriman. And Ahriman being a similar force to, let's say, we call it the Luciferic force, whereby the Luciferic force was a much different one. Ahriman focused on a kind of insinuating and encouraging a rational materialism, a loss of spirit, a loss of belief in the non-visible realms. And that this was the age of Ahriman. And Ahriman was the perfect analogy, or the perfect energy also, for attaching to technology, because that was a form of, again, dependency on materialism. And then, of course, I went back to look at Jung and his model of collective consciousness and the shadow. And so could that, because Jung's idea correlated with my own understanding of a consciousness field. So bringing them all together just seems so timely. And I was not saying, well, the origin of this malaise or the origin of this mental virus is not A or B or C. But if you look at all these other people looking at the sphere of this mental virus, then I think they all have something. They all add to the discussion. And we can see that something's gotten into our minds, quite literally. Something has affected human mental capacity. And these other people, whether it's Jung, Jack Forbes, Steiner, or Castaneda, they've all got some part of the puzzle. And that's what I wanted to present, to say that I'm not giving an answer, but I'm saying that there's something out and we need to be aware of it in order to push forward and push through this malaise.
Well, I caught something on the radio the other day, and it was a very throwaway, mundane piece about New Year's resolutions and, why they prove so difficult to stick to. And one of the speakers made a comment that caught my attention, and she said that, I'm paraphrasing now, but we all have that part of us, some thing that seems to have an agenda of its own that is not our agenda. And she was, of course, just referring to why you couldn't give up chocolate or why you couldn't stick with the gym or whatever in the new year. But I just thought it was interesting, and it kind of is echoed in what you just said.
That is interesting. My sense is that the more aware we become of this, the more we may see the patterns of it, and we may spot it, just as you spotted it in that quote. And then I think it's more prevalent, it's more present around us in the world, but we haven't really spotted it yet. And I've talked about that in the book, is that the main thing that the virus wants is to be unseen. Because once you know it's there, you start to see its traces. When I started looking for it more, I thought, yes, I can see it there and I can see it there. And that's why I gave a quote in the book from, I think, the Gospel of one of the Gnostic Gospels. Yeah, the Gospel of Philip. And I think this is an important point, because the Gospel of Philip says, so long as the root of wickedness is hidden, it is strong. But when it is recognized, it is dissolved. When it is revealed, it perishes. And I think that's the issue now, is that we are living in an age of distraction, where we're being distracted from ourselves. Our attention is being pulled out externally onto, whether it's onto matters of entertainment, consumerism, or matters onto world events, or matters onto anxiety and things that frustrate us, or through fear itself. We're being distracted from ourselves. And so we're not looking into our minds. We're not looking into what's really happening with ourselves. And I think now is the time to see the patterns, because when you see them, I think they will start to give the game away. And I'm also reminded of the Armenian Greek philosopher, mystic Georges Gurdjieff, because Gurdjieff talked a lot about human beings being automatons, and that we have so many different minds inside of us. Gurdjieff would say you have one mind to do this, one mind to do that. And just like the quote from the New Year's resolutions, Gurdjieff would often say people have a resolution to do something, but give them 10 minutes and they've changed their minds. Why? Because there's a certain kind of dislocation within our minds that's not helping us to really, I think, focus and see the puzzle. And I think now's the time to start to see the traces.
Well, wasn't it Gurdjieff? I think there's a quote from him in your book: "Contemporary culture requires automatons." Yeah,
it does require them, and that's so true on so many levels. Even on a wider social, political, cultural context, is that social management requires automatons. Now, this is another issue which I think is tied into this issue of the mind virus, is that we've now become a population of over 7 billion people. The majority are interconnected, and so many people are now hooking into this internet to hear in the news. They're more mobile, they have more information, they want to participate more in the world, they're looking for autonomy. And the social systems are thinking, how do we socially manage this? Because it's a huge issue. And so, and I think part of this mind virus is also that there's an element which is being manipulated to create a consensus narrative, a consensus mind programming, or let's say, a consensus dominant way of thinking that wants everybody to agree with it. And that's been socially constructed. And if we all spread this meme of consensus narrative thinking and sharing it, then we end up socially managing ourselves through fear of stepping out of this way of thinking or way of being. And so that's the best way to have a managed population, is that they manage themselves. And I think that's part of the issue we're dealing with here, Greg. I don't want to sound dystopian, but I think it's something we have to be aware of.
Yeah, in a previous era where we were less interconnected, it was more straightforward. It was easier to inculcate conformity, through consumerism, for example, or mass entertainment. It was a less sophisticated process. But as things have moved on now, it has had to take on different dimensions and enter the realms of mind and, of ideas and attitudes. And, because despite some appearances to the contrary, it's for all sorts of reasons, it's harder to buy us off now with dreams of play the game, keep your head down, don't think, and here's your reward. You know, the house, the car, the holiday, blah, blah, blah. The whole scheme to engineer the automatons that we were speaking about has had to take on a whole other level of sophistication. And the positive in that for me is in response to all energies and changes that are ultimately positive. So it's, it's action and reaction.
Sure, yeah. And, if we go further back in history, then control was a fear through body, physical fear of your well-being. Anyone who stepped out of line would be put in the stocks in the village square, or worse still, even hanged in the village square, because your body belonged to the state, and you could be executed. But now, as you said, the developed nations went into consumerism after the Industrial Revolution, and that consumerism supplicated people and made them enter this willing, in a sense, agreement or subservience to the social systems. On the other hand, some other nations had to rely on totalitarian regimes to keep their people in place. And that's still the case in some places. But you can see the pattern I'm looking at is that once these totalitarian regimes are falling around the world, and so they should, but what's replacing them is not so much a physical deterrent, but as you rightly say, a mental deterrent, because the sphere of operations of power has shifted from a physical domain into a mental consciousness domain. And we're very much now in the epoch where the battle is for our minds. The playground of vying for power and interest of power is with the human mind. And so we're in a kind of perceptual programming era now. And once we're aware of that, we can see more the patterns of how that's happening. Now, just to take the internet, because it's one of the biggest subjects of our time. When the internet first hit the public airways in the early 90s, and we know they had the dot-com bubble at the end of that decade, it was such a fresh playing field and so much innovation, and people were going crazy on it. And it was more or less a free-for-all. And yet just within 2 decades, we can see how much it's been appropriated as also as a surveillance system, as a data mining system with algorithms, and now fake news. And, in just that short time that the social management powers have jumped onto it. And so we're running out of time to understand the importance of perceptual and mental freedom.
Yeah, it is a concern in many ways, because for many people in the past, I think it's always been the case, but one's mind is one's final refuge, sort of place that no one else can enter, that is private, is your own domain. No matter, and almost anything that someone can do to your body. We hear stories of people in prison for decades, and prisoner of war camps being tortured, being abused, all sorts of horrendous external things happening to people, but within their minds was that one place of refuge, the one last vestige of the self that no one else can touch. Of course, there are ways your minds can be interfered with. More than ever, I would say that is kind of at risk.
Yes, it is. I mean, it's like it's a double-edged. It's at risk because it's the source, it's a seat of power and potential. And so it's at risk because from one side we have, let's say, dominant powers or dominant structures wanting to manage that because, of course, it is the seat of human freedom and human potential and human power. And on the other hand, it is going to be the saving grace. It's where we can find our power, because it is, like you say, the refuge. The question is what state we want our mind to be, because we can actually defend ourselves against the disturbances, the distraction, the dissonance in the world from the same place where we've been attacked to, i.e. the human mind. Because if we Now, I've used this analogy before of the drowning person. I'm not sure if I've spoken with you before, but I'll say it again. Now, when a person is drowning and they're calling out for help, generally the first thought that a person has is to rush out and jump in the water and try and save them. But actually, the Coast Guards actually say, unless you're trained, this is not the best way to do, not the best option, because what happens is the drowning person will pull you down with them. And so you need to have a state of training to not be pulled down. And I think that's an analogy we can use for the mind, is that the dissonance and the distractions and the turmoil that's in the world and which is going to come further down the line is going to seek our attention. And it's going to pull us in. It's going to pull our attention in, and therefore then our emotions get pulled in. And what happens is that we actually merge with that level, that energetic level. As they say, like attracts like. It may seem blasé to say like attracts like, but that is a general universal energetic law. And so if we get drawn into that, then we get pulled down into that lower energetic level, then we will be affected by it. We will be maybe frustrated, depressed, have anxiety, worry about our future, and that is because we have merged with that energetic state. At the same time, if we are able to make a conscious decision to detach from that, to observe it, not ignore it, but to observe it but not be pulled in, then we can maintain a mental state which can be out the reach of the infection and being affected. It's actually quite as simple as that, is that where we choose our mental attention to go to will affect what we pick up.
Energy flows where attention goes, as they say. It's one of those sort of mindfulness cliches, isn't it? Another one of those cliches is be the observer of your thoughts, but there's value in those ideas. Side point that is related to both what you're saying and also what you said earlier about entities or that dimension of our minds that appears to be operating or have a different agenda to what we think of as our agenda. You mentioned Jung and the collective unconscious and the idea that we can be inheriting the weight of the collective unconscious from those who came before us. What's your take on that? And also, basic human nature is not the problem as such. I think you say words to that effect in your book, but there is some kind of weight that we're carrying, and this finds an analogue in ideas of, the fall of humanity, something like that's echoed in the Bible, and also ideas about at some point we were doing well, and then whether it was civilization or agriculture or something happened, hierarchical society came along, domination, and that kind of changed everything, and that we're still carrying that baggage with us.
Yes, I mean, it's very difficult to have a pinpoint of origin. But of course, if only recently, I would say, really at the beginning of the 20th century, did we start to understand the collective unconscious, thanks to Jung. And only later with the latest findings in science and quantum science have we become to understand that there is such a thing as a collective energy field. And so we've only been made aware of it very, very recent in human history. Now, if we think that this has been the case from the beginning, is that the consciousness field has been out there, and when humans have developed a physical brain, they tuned into it. They've been participating with this mutual engagement in that we can receive consciousness, and we receive consciousness according to our capacity to interpret it. So, for example, again, using an analogy, when televisions were first invented, they were black and white. So we had obviously a small black and white picture on a 10-inch screen. Now, obviously, we moved on to color television. Then we moved on to high definition, then plasma screens. And, what we have now, I can't keep track of all the HDR and all the names we have. So if I switch on a 50-inch high resolution pixel television, and then I put on a small 15-inch black and white television at the side of it, the program that's being broadcast is the same. But the program that's being received is different because of the capacity of this receiver. Now, human consciousness, the brain was at a lower state of development, so it picked up let's say, a low bandwidth picture. But whatever it picked up, it wasn't aware that it was also putting back into the collective field. Now, over generations and generations and aeons of human history, of course, throughout everything that's happened, all that consciousness, not only all the beautiful and artistic and positive side of human consciousness, but all the suffering, all the cruelty, and other aspects have all gone back into the same field. And that field, of course, is very, very mixed. And I think we are now, like you said, kind of the hereditary receivers of that field. And it may be very well that we are at a stage where it's our responsibility to actually clean it out. And I actually put forward this hypothesis is that what's happening now on a global stage may be part of this kind of cathartic purification, whereby we've got to a stage where our capacity to receive consciousness is so open and so advanced that we are receiving a lot of this conscious field. But obviously we're picking up a lot of the detritus, a lot of the jetsam and flotsam that's been accumulated over the aeons of human history, and that is partly affecting our collective human mind now. And the way to deal with that is to cleanse it. And maybe that's why we need to externalize it upon the world, to see it for what it is, to realize that there is an issue. We do have a mental problem. The humanity is behaving crazily, and we need to purify. Well, not, I won't say purify. That's a loaded word, but I said we need to clean out this, and we need to clean our minds. And so that's part of this moving through transition. If we've talked about it, we've gone through a transition on many levels, and I think part of that is to clean out our minds. But by doing that, we have to project it out, and it's quite messy. It is like, putting your dirty linen in public, and because of our global technologies, we've seen a lot of that being played out, and it's harmful. But the positive side is it may be necessary, and also it may tie in with a lot of the breakdown of the dysfunctional social, cultural, human systems. They may be playing out together, so we may see new systems coming out with new ways of thinking at the same time. Now, if that happens, if we can clean our thinking, at the same time we clean out our corrupted cultural, social, political, and economic systems, we may see a boom time at the other side of this, but we have yet to get there.
Well, what you just said echoes a number of recurring themes here, that of repressed trauma manifesting itself, the march of technology accelerating these processes, making them not only possible but somehow inevitable. I also caught something in the media recently, again on the BBC, and they were talking to addicts and people with addictions, their failure or success in overcoming them, and again they were talking about this idea of part of their psyche somehow having a different agenda to what they saw as themselves, like this schizophrenic alter ego. And it made me wonder, that which is attacking us, coming down on us, wherever it's coming from, whether it's forced education, media manipulation, the forces of the technosphere in all their various guises, or maybe those entities that we've been speaking about, whatever form it takes, is it possible that this is somehow just part of us, that we're doing this to ourselves, that this is a manifestation of Jung's shadow?
Well, I think what is happening, Greg, is that the bottom line is that humanity is slowly waking up to the knowledge that they have great power, that great power and potential lies within the human being. And that's been alluded to over the aeons, especially in many spiritual or wisdom traditions. But people are now waking up to that. And so to counteract that, there's been a concerted effort to dumb us down. And I spoke about that in terms of education as well. And there was and I referred to the work of Gatt on that. And this teacher who wrote the book actually dumbing us down.
Oh, John Taylor Gatto.
Yeah. And Gatto's work is very valid to look into, because he actually won the New York Teachers Award. And he taught for 30 years before he eventually left the system because he was so disgusted by it. And he saw the dumbing down. And I think in general, there's a dumbing down of the human mind and all the human potential. So to keep us away from ourselves, and I think the bottom line is we need to come back to ourselves. So the positive side is we have all the resources we need. We just haven't tapped into them yet. And we're coming to a stage where this human awareness of that inner potential is rising, and so the counteractive forces are increasing. That's why we see that the game has been upped. The level has been increased because we're getting closer to that awareness, and so there is a dumbing down. Now, and I think this notion of these entities that have been around again in terms of human history, they've been a part of this game plan. And you mentioned at the beginning of our talk the Archons, which were coming out of Gnostic literature and Gnostic knowledge. And the Archons were supposed to be these kind of inorganic beings, very similar to what Don Juan talked about in Carlos Castaneda, that kind of mimic us and try to like I say, distract us and to take us away from focusing on ourselves. So I think I can't really pinpoint any one thing, but what I feel is that the time's getting closer to this release of human awareness. And I think part of that is because human consciousness is opening up. We are receiving more of the bandwidth. We've now got to the 50-inch plasma television, and so we're receiving a higher resolution picture. And through that picture, we're realizing that, hey, humans have this potential. We can listen to this inner voice and listen to our human instinct and intuition, and we can know how to move forward. We don't need these corrupt politicians telling us what is right and what is wrong. We can choose what life we wish to live, and that's very dangerous for a social system. So I think what we need to do is just listen more to ourselves and trust that inner voice and try to distinguish between what may be a false whisper in the ear and what may be your true voice. It may sound like a cliche with the angel and the devil on our shoulders, but I think that's a crude analogy. I think it's as simple as that. We need to come back to ourselves and come back more to an inner life and spend time and attention to nurture that inner realm rather than spending 100% of our times externalized and focused outwards.
I know recently you wrote an article for New Dawn magazine. It was just your brief take on, I think it was like you're looking forward to 2020 and beyond. And you addressed some of the issues we've been talking about in that piece. You used the word hyperreality. Now, I'm not sure if what I'm about to say is necessarily what you had in mind, but certainly at the minute it feels like, and we've had plenty of examples already in 2020, that lots of the malign influences on us coming from outside are being ramped up. There's staged spectacles. Staged spectacles can include things I was speaking to earlier, political rallies, sports events, also things like the US military assassinating that Iranian general. Whatever it is, whatever's actually behind it, it's certainly a spectacle. It's a massive distraction. And somebody who we lost recently was one of my favourite broadcasters, Clive James, Australian broadcaster and writer and poet. And one of his quotes that I always remembered, given that he was someone who worked in television, was "Spectacle is the enemy of thought." And so I feel that we're seeing a ramping up of these distractions, these sort of firework displays, metaphorically speaking. Oh, look over here, don't think, look over there. Wow, look at that.
That's definitely so. Yeah, it's the age of the spectacle. Hyperreality refers to the concept that we no longer know what is the real or what is the real reality with a small r, because we've been fed the spectacle. And we've been fed a narrative or a kind of storyline that we've kind of taken hook, line, and sinker. So yes, the start of 2020 started off with a bang with the US assassinating the Iranian general, and then obviously the US or the Western narrative is this general was very, very bad. He responsible for killing so many people. So most people in the West say, okay, he's bad. He deserved to die. And then they turn around and say, Russia meddled with the US election. Putin is bad. And we go, okay, Putin is bad. And then they say, look at this, look at that. And this, we have fake news now. We have manipulated news. Our news, mainstream media, and also the news sources, whether they're Associated Press or Reuters, come from just one or two sources. And so we just kind of get given this line, which is a spectacle. And that's why one of the chapters in my book I've called The Spectacle of the Absurd. Now, and it's come to that kind of position where we don't really know who to believe. We don't even know if we've been told the truth. And we don't even know what is good and bad anymore. Just because someone sits on the other side, another country, does that make them bad? Because we don't have the information to make those judgments. We're being given superficial information, and therefore we're making superficial opinions. And that is part of the hyperreality. We've kind of lost our moorings. It's as if someone has tied the rope away from the boat and it's drifting away on the sea, and we don't know which is starboard and which is port or which is north or which is south. And that's hyperreality. It's a bit of kind of being adrift.
I think you'll find this interesting. About 1 hour before this conversation began, I was checking out the news on the BBC, and the presenter was talking to a correspondent about this American strike against this Iranian general and his associates. And my ears pricked up when I heard the phrase, maybe this is one positive benefit of fake news. I thought, oh, what are they going to say? They said, well, because in America, they're saying that the retaliatory strike on the US bases, no one was killed, no one was injured, minimal damage. In Iran, the state media are saying that 80 personnel died in those retaliatory missile strikes against the US bases. Yeah. So yeah, the talking heads on the BBC were like, so the American audience gets their version. No one died, no one injured, minimal damage. The Iranian state media have said that 80 personnel died in those missile strikes. Both audiences are satisfied. But one of those accounts, or possibly both, are wrong, but they're just going to go with it. So this is a positive upside of it. And I thought, if anything kind of looks like an example of what you said in your piece, it's this.
Well, that's it. It totally obliterates the reality. And, I've used in my work the French social philosopher Jean Baudrillard. And he talks about the simulacrum, whereby, everything is almost a simulation because we don't know what is real. And he wrote a book in the 90s after the first Desert Storm Iraq War. He wrote a book called, I think something like The Gulf War Didn't Take Place. Because he said that, everything was fictionalized through news accounts. We have no idea what really took place. And so in a sense, you take that distance away from reality, and you're presenting people with that distance kind of simulation. And we're living within the simulation, and that's the hyperreality. And now, as you say, that news account you mentioned from the BBC is so flippant. It's like, well, as long as people are happy on both sides, it doesn't really matter. If that's a state of the human condition when we're on the precipice of warfare and people losing their lives, it's quite incredible. It's almost like we're just playing a Sims video game. We're all just playing with our avatars. I mean, what's next? Okay,
well, just a closing thought, Kingsley, and maybe get a little bit metaphysical and hark back to what we were talking earlier on about malevolent entities or mind parasites, mind virus, whatever it is. If we are on this, basically what you might call a journey of awakening to some extent, or we're going somewhere for some reason, if we're being impeded deliberately, is there any possibility that that's in itself is somehow ultimately positive, part of a growth process? Because if it is simply malevolent, then are we self-sabotaging, or is there some kind of autonomous force behind this? And if so, to what end? Why? I know that's a massive question, but...
Oh, it's a big question, Greg. It's, the big cosmic one. Well, I don't have answers, but I have thoughts and speculations. I think one of the things that is a handicap to the human nature is that we have little, if no, perception of the enormity and the immensity of reality. You know, we are within a slither spectrum of reality that we can perceive, and we perceive a very tiny portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. We don't even know what's out there. We still believe that maybe we are the only species in the universe and the cosmos. I think my sense is the cosmos is a huge playing field of so many intelligences, so many game plans, so much going on that simply because we're not aware of it, we can't see really a part of this whole bigger picture. Now, a lot of traditions, religious traditions as well as spiritual traditions, have talked about these malevolent forces from day one. Of course, we have the satanic forces in the Christian theology and the Luciferic ones. And in the Quran and Islam, we had the jinns, which were openly talked about as malevolent forces. Of course, in Gnosticism, we have the Archons that we talked about. And in Hinduism, they've talked about these forces. If you read Sri Aurobindo, his work, he's talked about what he calls the hostile forces. And I think the game plan is that everyone's vying for space on the playing field, that every species has to evolve and consciousness has to evolve, but you can't do it in a vacuum. You need friction. I think you need counterpoised forces to help that awareness to grow. For example, we only understand that there is darkness because we know what light is. You know, if you was in a dark room and born in a dark room and never saw light, you would not know that light existed until someone brought you light. So I think these actual counter distinctions and other polarity and forces are there to actually create the gameplay, which is part of the whole cosmic gameplay. So I don't know where it's going, but I feel it's going towards further advancement and further heightened perception. And consciousness, and therefore humanity with its access to consciousness and what we call human consciousness, is part of that developmental path, moving towards heightened perception. But in order to go through that path of developmental perception, we need to be we have this friction to make us aware of how we need to grow. And so if we take these malignant forces as being necessary to help us grow, I think that attitude is very positive and can be a developmental attitude. If we take these forces in a negative way and say, oh, I'm doomed, nothing goes right, I'm always being attacked, I've got no personal power and responsibility, then I think we're kind of losing the game. And so that's why I feel, yes, you're right, they are part of the equation, they are necessary, but we have to choose how we take them and how we can learn from them and how we can move forward to increase and heighten our perception and therefore play the game better.
Well, that idea actually finds an echo in the evolutionary concept of punctuated equilibrium, which is like, evolution is static on a plateau. Something happens, the punctuation in the equilibrium, and evolution is ramped up. Something changes, there's an X factor comes into play, and things ultimately go to a new level. So that's the background on which I choose to view, what we're currently facing, exactly as you say.
Yeah, and I concur. I would say that, what we see now in the world today is part of that, as you call, punctuated equilibria. What's sometimes called the breakthrough or breakdown of complex systems, is that in order to break through to a new level, you need an upsurge in energy. If the energy isn't utilized, the system can break down. Or if the energy is too chaotic, the system can break down. But if that chaotic energy can be organized and utilized, then the system goes to a higher complexity, a higher level. Now, using that kind of framework, I would say, and I would concur that consciousness is moving towards a heightened complexity of perception, but we need to be aware of it and take in that chaotic energy and organize it within ourselves. And that means keeping sane and not going crazy, and we can benefit from that heightened energetic, organized energy within us and as a human species.
Splendid. Well, today, Kingsley, we've been talking about your recent book, Healing the Wounded Mind, The Psychosis of the Modern World and the Search for the Self. Now, that's easy to find. It's available pretty much everywhere. Before we sign off, share details of your website, anything you might be working on, or just anything else you'd like to put out there.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. If you Google my name, Kingsley Dennis, you'll find my website. It's just kingsleydennis.com. There's not many Kingsleys around, which is good for Google age. And my website, I have a lot of information. I have, I think, about 40 or more articles, which are all free to download. And I put out a monthly newsletter if anyone wishes to sign up. And you can find my books also online, and you can drop me a line. So I'm available, and I'm also working on a fiction book. I hope to put out a children's novel in the coming year. So I'm trying to address these issues in different formats as well. And I'm just, ongoing, on researching, on thinking, on being.
Wonderful. Okay, well, once again, Kingsley, thank you so much for joining us on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Thanks, Greg. A real pleasure.